This is the podcast that we ask our guests from in front and behind the camera, how did they get their foot in the door? What was the key to unlocking their success? What's their story?
Our guest today is an Oscar winner. Growing up, he was influenced by the great John Williams to follow his dreams and become a composer. Today, he's living that dream. His credits include the award-winning King Richard, the hugely popular Bridgerton, and Disney's Haunted Mansion, to name a few. We chat about how he got his big break composing the critically acclaimed Green Book, why music shouldn't get the blame for manipulating an audience, and his Oscar-nominated score for the brilliant The Wild Robot. Our guest today is composer Kris Bowers.
Where did this all come from? Is this something that your family's big into music? Where did this love of music and composing come from?
My parents, they wanted me to play piano before I was born. Their music love. My dad's a music lover, and I think that they also saw music as a way for me to afford a life for myself that they might not have been able to provide financially. A lot of the talk when I was younger was about how much being really gifted as a musician would give me scholarships or like access to places and that kind of thing. Um, and for me, I fell in love with the idea of film music when I started to rely on the piano as a way to express myself, where, you know, being in middle school and having all kinds of life things go on that you're trying to figure out how to process and you don't really have a space to talk about it or you feel awkward talking about it or all of that. And I realized at some point that I could play piano from those emotional headspaces and move through that emotion in this very almost secret way where nobody knew what I was saying, but I felt very clear about what I was saying in the music. And so shortly after that realization, I was watching movies and listening to those scores and feeling the same thrill and excitement listening to, Star Wars or Jurassic Park or Lord of the Rings, like those scores I would listen to and be like, oh man, I feel like I'm watching the movie again just listening to this music. And that idea of there being a job where you translate emotions into music is what sparked this desire to do this. And so I was about maybe 12 when I told my parents like I want to find a way to get into writing music for film and TV, and that's a big part of my process now is just watching things like this movie, and it makes me feel so much that I the best way to respond to that is to respond through music.
That's crazy that you were as young as 12 and you were like, this is what I want to do, and you're doing
Yeah.
it. You're doing it now. Is it kind of weird to look back at that moment and then be in the cinema watching The Wild Robot and being like, this is something that I've brought this music to life. Is that mad?
Yeah, pretty wild. I mean, I think that, when I was a kid, it was a lot of naivete that made me say that. A lot of naivete, and also my parents being like, you need to decide what you're going to do when you're 12. And I think that, had I not had them have that much um, pressure, but also like desire for me to have this goal in mind, I don't know if I would have done that for myself, which is very helpful. But I think that I could have never predicted that it would have happened the way that it's happened in the time that it's happened. And I think with the Wild Robot, it's especially really impactful for me because I now I'm a dad, and so to like not only be watching this movie and feel all these like childhood dreams coming true and this feeling of like I would have loved this movie when I was a kid, and so this means so much to be a part of it and thinking about other kids watching it. But literally now my daughter has seen it, and the fact that she's watching this movie and she loves this movie and at some point is going to realize that really put it together that I wrote the music for. And I think that being able to share that with her is so emotional.
She's not at the age yet where she can kind of distinguish the fact that you've created this music. She's not quite at that age yet.
No, like she's only almost 3, and I feel like
Right, okay.
I've told her, and like I'll play on the piano, and like she actually knows when I play the main theme that's the Wild Robot. Or the other day I was like checking a clip on my phone, and she was in the other room, and she was with my mother-in-law, and she was like, "Oh, that's the Wild Robot. I hear the Wild Robot." So she can actually pick up the tune, but
Right.
anytime me and my wife are like, Dad, I wrote that music. She's like, yeah. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know if you really know what
Yeah,
we're
sure,
saying.
sure.
Yeah, she's like, yeah. I'm watching the movie. Like,
Yeah,
stop.
that's amazing. Well, the films that you mentioned, talking about I can't remember if it was Jurassic Park, Lord of the Rings, those kind of things that watch when you're a kid, and for all of us, that music is so iconic. And the minute you you hear the first note, you're like, I know what that is.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what with the Wild Robot. This is one of those ones. Like I've had the song in my head since the main theme in my head since I watched it, and that must be nice to kind of think, oh, not just this job, but some of the jobs you've done. People are going to have those songs. They're going to have those albums in their car. They're going to listen to them, and it's going to become, something that they're familiar with. Um, is that kind of when you're writing something? Do you ever kind of have that in mind, like, oh, this is the kind of thing I want to go for, and I want to, maybe a tad of the John Williams here, or a tad of, do you take influence from these other great composers?
Yeah, I think that for me, I'm all about studying. I think that's the thing that I love most about my job is that each project I get to study something and learn something, and that's what I feel has lended itself to my progress as a composer, not career wise, but just in terms of like my ability, is the fact that every project I don't really want to do the same thing I did on the last one. I want to do something that I have to learn and push myself and figure out. And so with everything, like with this project, it was a little bit of, okay, well, I'm going to study the way that John Williams develops themes because I still feel like he's by far the greatest when it comes to developing a theme and then progressing it over time in a story so that when you hear that theme at the end of the movie, you're like, oh man, like I feel so much just from this music, or hear it outside of the context of the movie. And I think that there are other scores that have great melodies, but then, either by the time the movie's done, you can't remember them, or like in the most emotional part of the movie, like that score is not there because I feel like sometimes the storytelling doesn't afford it, and so on and so forth. And so John Williams for me is always the best with that. So I always am studying, like with this movie, I was studying how he developed themes. The whole last action sequence of the Wild Robot is like just wall to wall music, and I studied the way that John Williams took the last 30 minutes or so of Star Wars, and how when you watch that last 30 minutes of Star Wars, he quotes the main themes like 50 something times, and it's all in these little small moments, and it's like Luke hearing Obi-Wan say use the force, and he closes his eyes, and like in that one moment you're da 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 da, like you hear all these little moments. And so for me that was really helpful to look at this long sequence and be mindful of like, okay, this one moment happens, I'm going to quote the theme for a second here, I'm going to quote this other theme here, and so on and so forth. But then at the same time I felt like when I first joined the project I thought I might approach the writing style in John Williams' style, but that didn't really work because the way he writes, I think, made this feel a bit too traditional. And so then I had to start looking at modern music to figure out, okay, like that main theme, for example, the melody and the chord progression functions much closer to like a pop song than it does like a classical composition. And so it's like finding a way to combine really rich and intricate and intentional classical orchestration and thematic development, while at the same time the production and the chord progressions and the melodies are on the more modern side, essentially.
Mm. Well, for me, it felt very well. I said before in the bit that we didn't record. I'm just going to admit to the audience we did 10, 15 minutes where I wasn't recording. But it felt very familiar, but in a good way, in a way that it felt like it's familiar. It's like a warm hug, but it's not. It's still new. It's something different. But it is that thing. I think it's the John Williams effect when you get to the end of the film and you hear those familiar notes and you hear things that you heard at the beginning. It's kind of that thing where you're like, oh, I feel like I know this, and it's kind of part of the whole story. Um, but in terms of like your first, like going back to your first ever job,
Mm.
and the first sort of gig, and I mean, I use IMDb for my homework, so forgive me if this is wrong because you never know, you never know. But the first, I believe it was 2010. You did a short film,
Mm.
The Little Big Kid,
Oh yeah.
and like obviously going from then to where you are now, so it's a completely different thing. But the process of going and working on something like that, your first ever job, what was that like? You're suddenly like, okay, this is my kind of, first job, first time composing. How did that come about, and what was that kind of like, the pressure of that?
Yeah, it was very funny because that came about. Just it was a friend that was a a film student, and she wanted me to score her film. And the challenges were the fact that I didn't really know the programs. I was still using, and maybe it was even, I don't know if it was Logic or GarageBand, or maybe no, I was using Logic because I started Logic in high school, but I had just learned how to even put the movie into the program. Um, and what's very funny about that movie is that if you go back and look at it, there's actually no score except for the end credits. And yeah, and the primary reason is that I was trying all these cues, and she just kept having this feeling that like it's taking her out of the moment to have this score. And no matter how much music I wrote or tried in different styles, or have it be really light and simple,
Mm,
she was just like, I really want to be dropped into this moment in a way that doesn't feel scored, and want to just diegetic sound of like the weather and the environment. And so she just had me write a little piece of music for the end credits. But I think that relationship of trying to figure out how to get at what a director's after when they don't really know how to communicate that, and she was telling me what she wanted and how she wanted to feel, and then ultimately for it not to work out, but to realize that it didn't work out because of her uh storytelling desires, rather than like I wasn't really getting it essentially. And I think the other thing I learned from it that I still believe to this day is that the reason I love collaboration is because I'm there to service the story, and we are trusting the filmmaker's view of what this story is supposed to be. And so if she decided the best thing for this movie is no score except for the end credits, then like that's the version of this movie that we're going to go after. And so really trusting the director and that collaboration, that their vision is the best way to tell the story, I think is something that has really always been my mindset. Like I never want to go into a situation being like, "Oh, I'm the composer. I know what we're supposed to do." And I'll present my ideas with a lot of confidence, but at the same time, wanting to make sure that it's known that like my place here is to service the story, and so therefore, if you feel differently than I feel, like I'm open to trying anything to get there. And because I have that mindset, it's led to these really amazing collaborations where a director pushes me in a direction I wouldn't have gone by myself, and I feel like the stories always benefit because of it.
mm. Does it help the fact that you've, because not only, working in the music department, but you've also directed and produced projects as well. I mean, no mean feat. I mean, you you directed a short that won an Oscar, which is pretty amazing. And being able to sort of do those different things and be involved in different parts of the industry, do you think being able to understand those different elements, does that help as well when you're going and just doing composing or just directing or things like that? The fact you've tried a bit of everything, do you think that helps?
Yeah, 100%. I think, my interest in filmmaking has allowed me to understand the language in a deeper way that I think only helps me as a composer. Where, on the basic level, it's like if a director says, halfway through the second act, I know what they're talking about. And the other part of it is that I have worked with editors, or have talked to editors enough now to understand what they're doing and the reason they're making their choices. And then on a deeper level, in terms of like the things I've studied storytelling wise, the psychological exploration of these stories helps me as a composer, where I'm able to look at something on a deeper level, projecting my own emotions on it. Because I think that the reason why the best stories are universal, is because even though I might not look like what this person looks like, or might not be dealing with the exact issue that they're dealing with, there's something about that symbolic journey of them confronting this other force and needing to figure out how to reconcile with that, is something that we can all universally empathize with and have experienced. And so I look at these movies and I might think about it on a different level, where, if it's not with Roz and Brightbill, for example, like it's not just about the idea of being a parent, or like becoming more human, or any of that kind of stuff. It's also about confronting the unknown, or like these parts of ourselves that like are hidden from us, or the question of what are we, what do we feel in our consciousness we're supposed to be versus like what else is possible. Like all these kinds of things I think are a bit more abstract in a way where I can go even deeper into my own imagination of what that means for me and pull from those emotions to write from. And I think I've only realized those deeper levels kind of reflecting on storytelling as a filmmaker.
What blows my mind about storytelling is, and I only learned this recently, and it seems to apply to almost every script. If you look at how a script is broken down and the main character's like goals and needs, if you look at Jurassic Park or if you look at Inside Out or you look at Forrest Gump, like completely different movies, you're like, holy shit, they've all broken down in a very similar way, and you can break them down to their bare bones, and the beats are the same almost,
Yeah,
which just like it's crazy because they can appear so different.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, 100%.
and I mean, yeah, that was a separate note, but it just it's something that I learned recently. I was like, that's mind blowing when you actually look at it close. Um,
Yeah, really helpful too, to like to kind of not feel so daunted by like the just like at least when you're going down to sit down and write a story, this idea of like, there's a map that you can look at is
yeah,
helpful. Yeah.
yeah, no, exactly, exactly. But two, I mean, you mentioned before that you obviously your piano skills. That's something I was, looking through all your credits and a couple of ones that came up that big fan of, but Green Book being one of them. And I realized that you also did you were the hand were you the hand double?
Yeah.
Hand double,
Yeah.
so you're doing all the piano playing because it's done very well in the movie where you it looks like it's obviously him playing. So that was you the whole time.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's probably a couple of shots where it is Mahershala actually playing, but
Yeah.
yeah, because that music is so complicated and complex, it kind of needed to be me for a lot of it.
That's crazy, man. Is that kind of that must be quite fun? You get to sort of do little bits like that as well. It's kind of keeping it a bit different, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely unexpected, and also this kind of way that I stumbled into the bigger parts of this industry. It's always so difficult as a young composer to figure out how do you break into doing a studio film and all those things. And so that movie requiring somebody to step into that role that could not only learn all the piano and play it, but also, be Marshall's body double and compose the score. Like it just really was the universe kind of came together to present that opportunity for me, and kind of helped with studios from then on trusting me to do a studio project.
That's pretty good out the bag. Like just the first studio film, like that movie did so well and it was so good. And that was that. So that was the way that happened. That the fact that you were the right man for the job, that you could do all the things they needed. It was that literally just right place, right time, right skill set.
Yeah, exactly. And the music supervisors from that, Tom Wolfe and Manish Raval, they're the ones that brought my name to the filmmaker Peter Fairley, and then also that project is actually kind of in a lot of ways what led to the Wild Robot, because it's the same studio, Universal, and that was actually my last Universal movie. I've done a bunch of movies, but the last time I worked with Universal was on Green Book, and so the only reason why Mike Knobloch and Natalie Hayden really were tracking me in a much more like personal way, I think, because they had this investment from back then. And I think that's a lot of what made them feel excited to bring me back into the fold for this project.
Mm. Well, the wild robot is, I mean, it's incredible, and we've already done this, but I'm gonna do it again and just say, I mean, I really enjoyed it.
I appreciate it.
Just an incredible, just the animation is amazing as well, and you mentioned before that it was a new technique that they did there, and it was all done with like brush strokes originally, and this isn't your job, but it's just fascinating. I think as we're
Yeah.
talking about the film, just to talk about that and the form of animation that was in this movie.
Yeah. So, when I first talked to Chris in our first meeting, the thing that was really interesting is that he talked a lot about how um, he was very inspired by early Disney animation, like things like Bambi, or even things like Studio Ghibli, like Miyazaki films. And when you look at that era of animation, it's a lot of hand painted images, And so he and Ramon Zebak and Jeff Budsberg and the other people on the animation team were wanting to find a way to bring this impressionistic look to the imagery. And what they first did was develop this technology where they could take a hand painted brushstroke and turn it into this three-dimensional image that they can then light, so that images and surfaces had this more handcrafted texture to them, and the colors and the shading were more emotional than they were like technically detailed and specific. And so, as you were saying with Roz, for example, she starts off as the only traditional CGI image within this kind of hand painted atmosphere and landscape. And then over the course of the movie, she becomes more hand brushed as she has debris and moss and scratches on her surface. And so for me, I think that made me feel inspired with the score to go from this more technological sound with her specifically. Even though the score is largely organic, there are always these synths that are present, like synthesizers, and especially in moments where we're looking at things from her perspective, it's very synth heavy and a lot of like sounds that sound like processing and bleeps and bloops and that kind of stuff. And as she becomes more human and develops these like human instincts, and that surface level changes, the sound of her score actually changes, where now it's much more organic. I introduce like human voices in certain moments where she evokes emotion. There's moments where she's seemingly feeling something, and instead of it being a synth pad, it's actually bowed metals, where it's like having these percussionists use a bow on a vibraphone or a bow on a bowl, and those things are meant to feel like this literal vibration that's happening within her. And so their treatment of Roz as a textural surface also influenced the way that I want to approach the textural sound to the score for her.
I mean, it's yeah, the score is incredible, and it's as you mentioned before, the theme is something that's so recognizable throughout the movie, and it comes back, and it is a theme throughout. Um, Taking influence from, what were the composers and the musicians, if you will, that influenced you, growing up, and when you're doing a job like this, is there are there particular people that you take influence from?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I said before, John Williams is always the person I go to. Like he's just the master at themes in my mind and the master at figuring out how to develop those themes over the course of a movie. I also really loved Howard Shore and John Powell, James Newton Howard. Going back further, Bernard Herrmann is another composer I'm a huge fan of. And also Hans in terms of just like him changing the way that we hear scores when it comes to like a more produced sound. I think that was another big influence here. Is I've always wanted to try to figure out how to bring the orchestrational complexity of somebody like John Williams with like the muscular production, like intensity and presence of Hans, and you know, really continuing to study those composers, I think is really always something that makes projects like this very exciting.
Mm. There's such different influences as well, as you say, very different sounds. But both have, films and projects that you go straight away, from the first note, what that is and who's composed it.
Now for a quick break. We'll be back to the episode shortly.
Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/life in film. And don't forget to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you enjoy this episode, please leave us a positive rating. Add us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok at Life in Film Pod. Essentially, please like and subscribe everything. It makes a huge difference. Thank you.
This podcast is sponsored by Betterhelp. Do you work in the film industry? Are you freelance? Or perhaps you have a 9 to 5? No matter what you do, mental health affects us all. I struggled early on in my career with the uncertainty of if and when I would ever work again, struggling to pay my bills, or simply with anxiety. Don't know about you, but being an actor, it's very important for me to maintain structure in the downtimes, and I found not only exercise, but talking to someone for me was a game changer. And so Life in Film has partnered with Betterhelp to provide you with access to the largest online therapy service in the world. And it can all be done from the comfort of your own home, from a phone, tablet or laptop. No commute, cutting down travel costs, and most importantly, it's affordable. With over 1,000 therapists in the UK, Betterhelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a wide variety of expertise in mental health. If you need someone to talk to and you're thinking of giving therapy a go, BetterHelp is a great option. And being a listener of the podcast, you get 10% off. That's 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/life and film. That's betterhelp.com/life and film. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support us, get early access and exclusive content and episodes, click to join our YouTube channel and become a member now.
And back to the show. Do you have advice for, people coming into the industry, maybe someone that is looking to become a composer of film?
Yeah, I definitely would say, first of all, just being as obsessed with your craft as possible and you know, really focusing on the things that speak to you and just trying to be as great as those things at those things as possible and not in any sort of way that's trying to find some sort of extrinsic goal or external thing. It's just really that's the thing that keeps us going in this process. Like for me, with each project, no matter how difficult it is, or the interpersonal dynamics, whatever they may be, positive or challenging, the thing that makes me love this job is how much I just get very excited when I discover something new or when I learn something new or when I go into a project not knowing how to do something and then all of a sudden I've figured that out by the end of it. So being obsessed about it, I think, is so important because it drives you. And then the other thing I'd say is just being aware of how our mind works and wanting to figure out whatever mental health process is going to serve you. Because I think that, we all have different needs when it comes to that. But for me, we spend so much of this time alone working in this industry and so much of this time trying to uh, please other people or get into the heads of somebody else into like what they might like especially in the beginning of a process. I'm trying to please the director, and when they say they want something happy or nostalgic or fearful or exciting, I am guessing what that means, and it can be kind of maddening to like spend so much time trying to imagine what this other person is thinking. And then, of course, in times where it becomes challenging in our careers where you don't get a project or something's not really working, it's easy to have that internal dialogue get really negative. And so I think that, for me, it's been very helpful to practice meditation or whatever else it is to just be mindful of the fact that like these things are arising out of our consciousness and like they're just thoughts that are coming up, and I can observe them, I can embrace them, I can let them go, I can like choose how I will interact with them. And I think that especially in these days where we're dealing so much with, I go on my, I do a doom scroll for 10 minutes and all of a sudden I'm like in my head again. I think that like having those practices are so crucial for anybody getting into this industry and dealing with anything that can plague their mind and get in the way of the process of making music, which is so amazing that that's you can make a job of that.
Mm. I love the fact it just sounds like it's not just your job, it's obviously your passion, it's obviously your hobby, it's all of the above. And is that something that it must really help, in the downtime in between jobs, which I'm sure there isn't much downtime these days. I mean, you're working on, there seems to be like, projects coming left, right, and center. But is that something that really helps you in the downtime do you kind of just write music? Do you kind of what are the things you do to sort of stay sane in between jobs?
Yeah, these days it's been a lot of reading and a lot of reading about um kind of different. It's always tied to my like process, but it often isn't music specific. Like right now I'm reading a few books, and like I'm reading a book about leadership because I do oversee like a handful of people that work directly for me, but also at times like when we are finishing a project, there's an entire orchestra, there's orchestration, there's like all these people that I'm in charge of. And then also as I step into filmmaking more, thinking about the things I need to work on as a leader is something that I spend a lot of time doing in my spare time. Or also I'm reading a book about how languages develop because I think that's really fascinating, how we like have found these sounds to articulate these like ideas in our head essentially. And then read a lot about like psychology or composers like lives and things like that. So in the my free time, it's a lot of reading and watching movies and studying them, kind of doing what you were talking about, where like my wife hates watching movies with me sometimes. Actually, she doesn't hate it, but she laughs because like literally every few minutes I'm like checking how far we are into the movie and kind of like taking notes secretly of like what's happening at certain points and like just trying to track like, okay, if I break this movie down into like X amount of scenes, like will the same trajectory happen? Like what happens if I draw a map of this movie and compare it to other movies? So like I'm always doing that kind of stuff. And then I think that I spend so much time working, writing music that the music making is more of the job, and it's still a positive way in a way that I love. But any free time I have is usually spent outside of the studio and like also going on walks and going to the gardens with my family and all that kind of stuff is just a way to feed back into the work.
I love that. I feel like if you are in the film industry, whatever that is that you do, every time you watch a movie, you're looking at the makeup or you're looking at the way it's shot or the way it's acted. Like
Yeah.
there's no getting away from that, but it's still enjoyable.
So there's me, I'm like, man, it's so wild that like there's this medium where we can tell people how to feel. Like it's always so funny to me when like as a composer, there's so many times where people are like, "Oh, I don't want the music to tell me how to feel. Like I don't want to be like that's just so manipulative when the music's telling us how to feel." And I'm always like, one, we know when that's happening, and if we feel a feeling, like we can't really be manipulated into that. We either feel it or we don't. And like there are times where like we can tell that we're being manipulated and we don't feel that way. And if we feel something, it's because it worked. But then the other thing that's bigger for me is like, then what are we doing when we're choosing very specific words, we're choosing camera angles, we're choosing lighting, we're choosing all these other elements to be very specific about how I'm supposed to feel about this person in this moment. That like that's so fascinating to me. That's amazing when I watch something and I'm like, wow, they chose that shot and it's making me feel something. Like that's crazy. And so I just love like geeking out about those details and all the other like crafts of filmmaking.
Yeah, that is a very good point, actually. It's something that people have said recently. They're like, "Oh, the music's manipulating me." All of it is.
Exactly.
All
All
of
of it.
it, all of it
Yeah.
is manipulating you. I used to love. I mean, sometimes you still get it, and I think with the classic composers like John Williams, like you can say it's manipulation, but his films are they're just the music is incredible. And if you look back at like films in the 90s, the 80s, I'm thinking like Home Alone, which he obviously did.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lot of very obvious, how you're supposed to feel in a moment with the songs and everything else. But I love that. Like I don't, some people don't, as you say, feel like they're being manipulated. I'm like, yeah, I love that. I love to know and be told exactly what I'm supposed to feel.
Yeah.
It's somehow nostalgic because I think it was probably done more in the 80s and 90s. I don't know. You'd know better than I do, but I feel like when I watch an older film, the music is more of a presence than it is these days. I don't know. Maybe I'm just talking shit, but
No, I definitely agree. I think that like, I was watching something recently where somebody was talking about how like, I think in a lot of ways we were unashamedly like feeling things and like okay with the art expressing these feelings. And I think that there's definitely this interesting aspect to making things that are a bit more like vague or ambiguous or like you decide how you feel. I'm not going to tell you how to feel and all that kind of stuff. And there's a place for it. But I definitely think that in addition to that, and for me, sometimes even more than that, it kind of goes back to like me when I was a kid. Like when I was a kid, I grew up in environments where I had to pretend not to care. Like I had to pretend that like, oh, I don't care if I get good grades, or I don't care if like this girl likes me, or I don't care if like I like like my parents are mad at me. Like this idea of like hiding and masking my emotions. And then secretly I was playing piano because I was like, I have all these feelings that I can't tell anybody that I feel and I need to express
singing
those feelings.
away just to,
Yeah. And
yeah.
so I think that like that's the thing I love about those movies. It's like it is like we are making something that people can go to like get away from their current life or or like or feel their current life even more, but it's something that like sometimes can be a way to cathartically release things that we feel like we can't in our everyday life. And so why not have some of those things be unashamedly emotional and really get those things out because I feel like real life is for trying to figure out how to compartmentalize like you
Yeah,
don't have to
100%.
in a movie.
Yeah, and the fact that a movie is, you can always go back to it.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
you
for sure.
can relive that experience as well, whether it be through the music or the way it looks or the way it's shot, the way it's lit, whatever it is.
Yeah,
That's what makes it so special. It is forever. It's, once it's done, it's there.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's what makes film so special, I think. And you know, one of the reasons why I'm inspired by film. You know, you can look back at a movie that we've already talked about a few there, where you look back at the ones that really influenced you as a kid, and they're always there if you want to go back and watch them again.
Yeah,
Um,
for
but anyway, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent. I was going to ask you about
sure.
collaborations, and you know, there's a few people in your career that you've worked with several times. And one of my favorite films that you've done is King Richard.
Oh, thanks so
Absolutely
much.
loved that movie. And it kind of I saw it actually at London Film Festival, so I didn't really
Oh, wow.
know much about it. I just knew the cast, I knew roughly what it was about, but I just had no idea. So it was a bit of a surprise, and I just absolutely loved it, man. What a great story, and what a great project. And obviously that was Ronaldo Marcus Green, who you've worked with several times.
Yeah.
Not only on that brilliant film, but I've had him on the podcast actually
Oh, wow. Oh, man. That's awesome. That's awesome.
when he was doing Bob Marley, which is obviously something
Right.
that you did as well.
Yeah, yeah.
When you're working on a film that is obviously about someone so influential in the music industry, how do you go about kind of going into a project like that? Because it must be fairly pretty daunting, I guess.
You know, it can be. I think that at the same time, luckily, so much of their music is usually in the movie that
Mm,
um that's what people are like are ready to hear and see and relive and sing along to. And the score's job is to represent more of the internal things that are happening. And you know, sometimes what I do is try to have the score be as directly influenced by their music as possible.
mm,
And sometimes what I do is try to write something that is not opposite, but like separate from it so that it also creates a clear um, separation of score and song so that we know that like this is a moment where we're reflecting internally versus externally. And so much of the Bob Marley thing, first it was talking to Ziggy because Ziggy was very involved in that about, you know, we went down to Jamaica and recorded some Nyabingi percussion because Bob was really into Nyabingi religious music and learning about that and trying to figure out how to use aspects of that in the score. We also talked about the idea of like having this deconstructed version of some of his instrumentation and using like guitars in different ways. But then also the studio, like the producers really loved the idea of, and the editor really loved the idea of like these kind of atmospheric strings and things like that. So like
mm,
that became a sound that has doesn't have much to do with Bob Marley specifically, but I think because everything else was kind of coming more from him, that was something that became an interesting juxtaposition against his music. And then sometimes I'm like looking at a chord progression and like might pull from that chord progression. Or something about like, you know, I've worked on musicals. And I think that that's something that's interesting with like The Color Purple, for example, is like, you know, having to write a score that pulls from the fabric without like it just regurgitating the same things.
mm,
It then becomes like, okay, well, if I just take this one melody and just take the shape of that melody and write a melody in that shape, will that kind of subconsciously make us feel like that song? Or if I take a chord progression and like do a variation on that chord progression, will it connect us to that character? And
mm,
so it's like trying to find ways to take that material and like ingest it and uh either create some sort of like broken down version of it or like some piece of it I can always say like this is exactly why it goes back to who the movie is about or the music that's in the movie, but at the same time it's its own thing.
mm. You mentioned The Color Purple there, and I might be completely wrong. Was that the first version of that film was Steven Spielberg?
Yeah, yeah.
Was it John Williams that did the? I
It
can't
was
remember.
it was actually Quincy Jones.
Oh, oh right, was it?
Yeah.
Oh,
And
I've
also
completely
that
forgot.
that actually was what introduced me to Quincy as a composer because I only knew him up until that point as like Michael Jackson's producer and the guy that created the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Mm,
But it wasn't until my freshman year of high school we watched The Color Purple in class and and I saw Quincy Jones's name, and it made me excited about the fact that he was a film composer and like dove into his career.
Mm. That's that man. That's so fun that you kind of, yeah, each project can be a complete, you're doing a whole history lesson on something and you can really delve in and kind of, learn and find new things. As you say, you love reading, so it must be a bit of a treat when you get something like that with the backstory that you can really get into.
Yeah.
We have to wrap up now, but Kris, thanks so much for taking the time. Absolutely love The Wild Robot. And I didn't get to say it, but congratulations on the Oscar nomination and the BAFTA nomination. Got my fingers crossed, man. To be honest, I cannot think of another film that, like, out of all the animated films that we've had in the past 12 months, it's got to win everything. I hope so. All the best, man. And
Thanks so much.
thanks so much for taking the time. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'll talk to you soon.
All
Have a
right,
good one.
take care, mate. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to support us, get early access and exclusive content and episodes, click to join our YouTube channel and become a member now. Thank you to our guest Kris, and thank you to Taylor at IDPR. As always, thank you to our sponsor, BetterHelp.